The Charleston air hung with that peculiar stillness that always preceded change. Eleanor Campbell stood at her condo window, 68 years carved into the fine lines around her eyes, watching sunlight dapple the harbor waters. Sailboats bobbed like toys against the distant horizon, while she folded summer blouses into a worn blue suitcase. Maine awaited her tomorrow, the first real vacation since Richard's passing 3 years ago. The radio played softly, some forgotten melody from decades past. Eleanor hummed along as her fingers traced the familiar ritual of packing and preparing. Everything in the condo stood tidied and ready, plants watered, mail stopped, neighbors notified. For once, there was nothing to worry about. A rare feeling of completion had settled over her like a comfortable shawl. The phone's shrill ring severed her tranquility. The caller ID displayed Sarah's name, her daughter-in-law of 7 years. Eleanor answered with a smile in her voice, but the warmth evaporated as Sarah's words tumbled through the connection. Sarah's voice trembled, nearly breaking with each syllable. "Mom, you have to trust me. Tonight put a hidden camera in the living room and leave the apartment. Don't ask questions. Just go." Eleanor's hand tightened around the phone. A laugh caught in her throat, an instinctive attempt to diffuse the absurdity, but it came out strangled. "What are you talking about? I can't explain right now." Sarah whispered, her breathing uneven, the kind that stemmed from fear rather than mere anxiety. "Please, you'll understand tomorrow. And don't tell Michael." The mention of her son's name triggered a protective instinct, but before Eleanor could press further, the line went dead. She stood motionless, still clutching the receiver, as the refrigerator's mechanical hum suddenly seemed thunderous in the quiet apartment. Through the window, Charleston's evening light painted the harbor in amber hues. A cruise ship inched toward the terminal, its white bulk gleaming against the darkening sky. The familiar scene now felt alien, as though someone had shifted everything in her world by a few imperceptible degrees. Memories flashed unbidden. Michael at 8, solemn-faced, as he presented her with a handmade Mother's Day card. Michael at his law school graduation, beaming with pride. Michael last Christmas, distracted and checking his phone throughout dinner. Had there been signs she'd missed conversations that ended abruptly when she entered a room? Questions about her finances that seemed innocent at the time. Eleanor opened the drawer where she kept miscellaneous electronics and pulled out a small camera she'd once used to watch a neighbor's cat. The device felt heavier than its actual weight as she checked the battery and connected it to her phone. The setup process was mercifully simple, requiring only a few taps to complete. She placed the camera on the middle bookshelf, angled toward the entryway, its tiny blue light blinking once before she camouflaged it with the spine of a hardcover novel. A tremor passed through her hands as she gathered her purse and an overnight bag. What exactly was she running from? The answer remained elusive, a shadow without form, yet Sarah's voice had carried unmistakable terror. The door locked behind her with a sound that felt unnervingly final. Charleston's night air pressed thick and heavy as Eleanor drove over the bridge toward her sister Rita's neighborhood. The tide lay low, exposing silvered marshes under the moonlight. Each streetlight she passed flickered like a nervous pulse, matching the rhythm of her heartbeat. She tried to calm herself with rational thoughts. She was being ridiculous, an old woman chasing phantoms through the corridors of her imagination. Yet Sarah's voice echoed in her mind, sharp and trembling. Eleanor had known her daughter-in-law to be practical and measured, not given to dramatics or flights of fancy. If Sarah was afraid, there must be substance behind her fear. Rita's house sat in a quiet cul-de-sac shadowed by ancient magnolias. Her sister opened the door before Eleanor's finger reached the doorbell, her robe loosely tied, her face creased with sleep and concern. "Eleanor, I thought you were flying tomorrow." Rita's eyes narrowed, taking in the overnight bag and her sister's tense expression. "I needed to get out tonight." The admission was all Eleanor could manage. Her sister didn't press for details, the unspoken protocol between them for over 6 decades. Questions would come later, after whatever storm was brewing had passed. Rita made chamomile tea that smelled of bygone summers, and they sat at the kitchen table in companionable silence. The clock ticked steadily, the refrigerator hummed, and Eleanor felt the strange awareness of her own heartbeat, constant but uncertain, like a metronome keeping time for a song she couldn't quite remember. Later, lying awake in Rita's guest room, Eleanor watched ceiling fan shadows turn slow circles across the wall. She reached for her phone multiple times, tempted to check the camera feed, but each time she hesitated. The fear of seeing nothing competed with the greater fear of seeing something. Both possibilities twisted inside her like twin snakes. Somewhere in the darkness, the camera she'd left behind continued its silent vigil, recording a home she suddenly wasn't sure belonged to her anymore. Dawn arrived with pale quietude, the kind of Charleston morning that carried the faint scent of salt and rain-dampened wood. Eleanor hadn't slept. Rita's soft snores filtered through the wall as Eleanor sat up, reaching for her phone with stiff fingers. The camera app icon waited on her screen, innocent and ordinary. For a long moment, she simply stared at it, gathering courage like a woman collecting shells at low tide, one piece at a time until her hands were full. Then she opened it. The feed flickered to life, showing her living room bathed in the grainy half-light of nighttime surveillance. The clock on the wall read just after midnight. Everything appeared exactly as she had left it. The sofa cushions arranged at perfect angles, the lamp positioned just so, the throw blanket folded with hospital corners. Relief began to seep through her veins. Then the front door opened. Michael entered first. Her son moved with casual confidence, wearing the charcoal jacket she'd given him last Christmas. Behind him came Peter, their cousin, whose financial advice Michael had begun to follow with increasing devotion. A third man entered last, carrying a toolbox, his face unfamiliar beneath a baseball cap. The stranger moved directly to her study door, kneeling before the lock, while Michael and Peter began moving methodically through the room, pulling open drawers, examining shelves, speaking in low tones that the camera's microphone nonetheless captured with perfect clarity. "She'll be gone for a week," Michael said, his voice relaxed and matter-of-fact. "Plenty of time to get it listed." Peter laughed, a sound that raised the hairs on Eleanor's arms. "You sure she'll sign the paperwork when she gets back?" "She won't have to. I've got the forms handled." The oxygen seemed to vanish from Rita's guest room. Eleanor watched her son discuss dismantling her life with the casual air of someone planning a dinner menu. The locksmith asked something inaudible, and Michael replied, "Just need access to the safe. She keeps the deed and account information in there. Once we cover the loans, everything will be fine." "Cover the loans," he'd said with such nonchalance, as though erasing years of trust required nothing more than a mundane phrase. The words sank like stones in a still pond. Eleanor pressed a hand to her mouth, watching him sort through drawers that once held birthday cards, photographs, mementos of a shared history. Every gesture appeared practiced and efficient, absent any trace of hesitation or remorse. When they finished their inventory, the three men departed as easily as they had arrived, the door closing behind them, with the soft finality of a period ending a sentence. Eleanor sat frozen in Rita's guest room, the phone trembling in her lap. Outside, the sun climbed higher over the marshes, turning the water to molten gold. Inside, something within her broke quietly, cleanly like glass, finally yielding to pressure. The boy she had raised still lived somewhere in that man's face, but she could no longer see him. By mid-morning, Charleston streets shimmered with heat. Eleanor sat in a small cafe off Meeting Street, fingers wrapped around a coffee cup that had gone cold. She'd called Sarah after watching the footage, her voice barely steady enough to form words. Sarah had agreed to meet immediately, asking her not to tell anyone, not even Rita. When Sarah arrived, she looked nothing like the composed young woman Eleanor had welcomed into their family. Her hair was pulled back hastily, her eyes shadowed by sleepless nights, her blouse wrinkled as though she'd dressed in darkness. She slid into the seat across from Eleanor, glancing nervously toward the window before speaking. "I saw it too," she said quietly. "I didn't know if you'd believe me unless you witnessed it yourself." Eleanor's throat tightened. "How long have you known?" "A few weeks," Sarah admitted, twisting her wedding band. "I was helping Michael organize some files for the practice when I found copies of your signature on power of attorney forms. They looked wrong, too perfect, too traced. When I asked about them, he brushed it off as nothing important. But last week, I overheard him talking to Peter about selling the condo after moving you into a comfortable place." Her voice faltered. "That's when I called you. I couldn't stay silent anymore." Eleanor stared at her daughter-in-law, caught between gratitude and disbelief. The air between them felt fragile, as though one wrong word might shatter it beyond repair. "He's your husband, Sarah." "I know," she whispered, eyes downcast. "But what he's doing isn't love. It's desperation." She rubbed her hands together, trembling slightly. "He's deep in debt from a failed investment project. Peter keeps pressuring him to fix it quickly, even if it means taking what isn't rightfully theirs. I tried to stop him. He wouldn't listen." Outside, a trolley rattled past its bell, echoing down the street. Sarah looked up, eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm sorry, Eleanor. I didn't marry him for this. I thought he was better." Eleanor believed her, perhaps because Sarah's shame seemed too raw to fabricate, or perhaps because she needed to believe someone still cared enough to tell her the truth. For the first time since that awful dawn, she didn't feel completely alone. That afternoon, Sarah drove Eleanor to a law office tucked behind a row of oaks on Broad Street. The sign outside read, Pearson Holloway Elder Law and Estate Services, a place Eleanor had passed countless times without ever imagining she would need its services. The reception area smelled faintly of lemon polish and old leather-bound books. Mr. Pierce was a man in his early 60s with silver hair and a measured voice that bestowed weight to each carefully chosen word. He listened without interruption as Eleanor explained what she'd witnessed, what Sarah had discovered, and what her son was planning. His eyes softened with understanding, but never drifted toward pity. When Eleanor finished, he folded his hands atop his mahogany desk. "Mrs. Campbell," he said gently, "what you're describing qualifies as potential financial exploitation. We'll need to move quickly to protect your assets. The first step is filing an injunction on the property title so no transfers can occur while this is under review." Eleanor nodded, struggling to maintain her composure as reality solidified around her. Mr. Pierce guided her through numerous forms, each page dense with legal terminology that blurred before her eyes. Her signature appeared again and again on the injunction on bank authorizations to freeze joint access on revocations of the power of attorney that Michael had quietly attempted to establish. Each time her pen touched paper, Eleanor felt as though she were cutting another thread that had once bound her life to her son's. When they finished, Mr. Pierce placed the stack neatly in a folder embossed with his firm's logo. "This will hold for now," he said, his voice a reassuring anchor in the storm. "We'll notify the clerk's office and your bank by morning. Keep any messages or documents he sends. Remember, Mrs. Campbell, you're not powerless. You're protecting what's rightfully yours." Eleanor wanted to believe him, yet the word protecting stung with its implications. It meant acknowledging danger, admitting that her own son had become someone she needed to defend herself against. Sarah waited by the door, silent but steadfast. When Eleanor rose to leave, her knees trembled beneath her. Mr. Pierce handed her his business card and said, "We'll handle this discreetly. No confrontation until everything is legally secured." Outside, late afternoon light slanted across the cobblestones, burnishing the old city in gold. Eleanor clutched the folder of documents to her chest as they walked toward the car. It felt heavier than its physical weight suggested, heavier than any stack of paper and proof could possibly be. She had always believed family represented the safest harbor a person could find. That afternoon, she learned how painful it was to build a wall between love and safety, and how necessary that wall sometimes became. 2 nights after the meeting at Mr. Pierce's office, sleep continued to elude Eleanor. She stayed at Rita's house, the folder of legal documents resting on the nightstand beside her, like a sentinel, its presence both reassuring and devastating. When the clock struck midnight, she opened the camera app again. The screen illuminated her face with its blue glow. At first, the room appeared undisturbed, the lamp by the sofa casting its warm circle of light, the framed photographs on the mantel standing at attention, the faint reflection of streetlights gleaming in the window glass. Then the front door opened again. Michael entered this time with Peter following close behind. They moved differently now, less cautious, more proprietary, as though they already owned the space. Peter carried a clipboard while Michael swept his phone's flashlight across shelves and cabinets. "There's more here than I thought," Peter said, chuckling as he made notations. "You could clear half your debt just with her antiques." Michael didn't respond immediately. He reached up to touch the porcelain vase on the mantel, the one Eleanor and Richard had purchased in Savannah on their 10th anniversary. His fingers traced its contours with something almost like reverence before his expression hardened. "Just list it all," he muttered, voice flat. "We'll sell it fast before she starts asking questions." Eleanor's throat constricted. She wanted to look away but couldn't tear her eyes from the screen. The camera lens captured every careless gesture, Michael's hands rifling through drawers that contained generations of memories, Peter photographing jewelry pieces with his phone, the two of them talking like businessmen dividing assets after a successful acquisition. At one point, Michael paused before her favorite bookshelf, the one containing first editions that Richard had collected throughout their marriage. His face looked older in the harsh flashlight beam, worn with worry. For a heartbeat, Eleanor glimpsed the boy who used to leave love notes on the refrigerator door. Then he turned away, and that boy vanished like morning mist. Eleanor pressed the record button on her phone, saving the live feed with timestamp and date displayed in the corner. Mr. Pierce had shown her how to archive it properly, how to store backup copies in case anything happened to the original device. The process felt mechanical but necessary, like preparing for a hurricane that had already made landfall. When the footage ended, the room on screen fell still once more. Eleanor sat motionless in the darkness of Rita's guest room, the phone warm in her hands, the air around her suddenly thinner, as though someone had quietly removed a percentage of the oxygen. In the morning, she drove to Pierce's office again, the recorded video weighing her phone down like a stone in her pocket. He watched the clips attentively, his jaw muscles working beneath the skin. "This is more than enough," he said finally. "We'll proceed tomorrow." Enough. Such a small word for something that had fractured everything she believed about love, family, and home. By morning, the previous night's rain had cleared, leaving Charleston washed clean and gleaming. Eleanor wished the same could be said for her heart. Mr. Pierce called early, his tone steady as ever. "Mrs. Campbell, everything's filed and verified with the court. If you're ready, we can go today." Eleanor told him she was ready, though she'd learned that readiness didn't equate to peace. It merely meant there was no alternative path left to take. They met outside her building just after noon. The air smelled faintly of salt and sun-warmed pavement, and the magnolia tree beside the entrance dripped with lingering raindrops from the night's storm. Mr. Pierce stood beside her with a slim briefcase. Next to him waited Mr. Hanley, the building manager, kind-hearted but visibly uncomfortable, clutching a clipboard like a shield against the unpleasantness to come. Sarah arrived last, her complexion pale beneath hastily applied makeup. She'd barely slept. Eleanor could see it in the shadows beneath her eyes. She didn't say much, just nodded once in greeting. The gesture contained volumes. They ascended together. The hallway felt narrower than Eleanor remembered the familiar carpet suddenly foreign beneath her feet. When she unlocked her door, voices drifted from inside Michael's low and tense Peter's, sharper and more insistent. "She won't even notice. Just sign it when I—" Michael stopped mid-sentence as the door swung open. For a long, suspended moment, no one spoke. Peter retreated toward the sofa, muttering something about coming back later. Michael's gaze darted between the unexpected arrival's panic and disbelief warring across his features. "Mom," he said finally, attempting a smile that never reached his eyes. "You weren't supposed to be back yet." "No," Eleanor answered quietly. "I wasn't." Mr. Pierce stepped forward and placed his briefcase on the coffee table, opening it with a soft click that seemed to echo in the stillness. "Mr. Campbell, I represent your mother. This property is now under legal protection, and you are to refrain from removing or altering any contents." Michael blinked confusion, giving way to indignation. "This is ridiculous. She's my mother." Eleanor raised her phone, the video already cued. She pressed play and the sound of his voice filled the room. "We'll sell it fast before she starts asking questions." The color drained from Michael's face. "Mom, it's not what you think." "I've seen exactly what it is," Eleanor interrupted, her voice surprisingly steady. "You came into my home. You went through my things. You planned to take everything your father and I built." The silence that followed felt weightier than any shouting match could have been. Even Peter couldn't meet her eyes. Sarah stood near the doorway, hands clasped tightly together, tears catching the light. Mr. Pierce gathered several documents from his briefcase and handed them to Michael. "You're being served notice of property protection and revocation of power of attorney. You will vacate immediately. Building management will change the locks within the hour." Michael's mouth opened, but no words emerged. He simply stared at Eleanor, something breaking quietly behind the anger in his eyes. When Mr. Hanley presented her with the new set of keys, they felt cold against her palm. Eleanor turned toward the door, Sarah close behind her. As they stepped into the hallway, she heard the first sob tear from her son's chest, low, disbelieving, and far too late. She didn't turn back. Some goodbyes happened without a single word being exchanged. The following weeks moved like slow water, steady, silent, and impossible to stop. Word spread through the building faster than Eleanor had anticipated. Neighbors who once waved cheerfully from their balconies now lowered their eyes when they encountered her, uncertain what to say. A few offered polite condolences, but most avoided the subject entirely. Charleston prided itself on gentility almost as much as it loved its gossip, and Eleanor had provided fodder for both. Mr. Pierce handled most of the legal aftermath. Michael was under investigation for attempted property fraud, though the prosecutor had agreed to consider a reduced charge. Peter refused to answer Michael's calls, and eventually left town for a business opportunity in Atlanta. Eleanor heard through Mr. Pierce that Michael had admitted to poor judgment, but maintained he'd never intended to harm her, only to help with financial restructuring. The sterile phrasing almost erased the reality of what had happened. Sarah visited one afternoon to return the spare keys Eleanor had given her years earlier. She looked thinner, paler than before, her wedding ring conspicuously absent. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed the keys on the counter. "I'm moving out," she said quietly, not meeting Eleanor's gaze. "I can't stay with him after this. I thought I'd feel guilty about leaving, but mostly I just feel tired." Eleanor wanted to offer comfort, but there were no easy words for such a moment. Instead, she made tea, and they sat together in silence until Sarah finally said, "I'm sorry, Eleanor. I never wanted it to end like this." "I know," Eleanor replied simply. "None of us did." When Sarah left, the apartment felt impossibly still. The rooms were clean again, everything in its proper place, but emptiness lingered like humidity, something you learned to breathe around rather than overcome. Eleanor spent her days tending to small tasks, reorganizing bookshelves, trimming the ficus plant, watching sunlight trace patterns across hardwood floors. In the evenings, she often caught herself listening for Michael's voice in the hallway, knowing it would never come. Rita visited frequently, bringing casseroles and determined cheer. "You did the right thing," she repeated during each visit, as though repetition might somehow ease the pain. But right and easy rarely traveled the same path. Sometimes Eleanor woke in the middle of the night and stood by the window looking out over the harbor. City lights shimmered on the water, and for a moment everything seemed suspended between what had been lost and what hadn't yet begun. Safety had returned, yes, but peace kept its distance, waiting for her to learn how to live with the silence. 3 weeks after the confrontation, Eleanor finally boarded the plane she'd almost forgotten about. The ticket to Maine had been waiting on her dresser, tucked beneath a paperweight, as though it had known she would eventually need its promise of escape. She wasn't running away anymore. She was simply keeping the promise she'd once made to herself, to see the ocean from a different shore, to remember there were horizons beyond the ones she'd grown accustomed to viewing. The trip unfolded quietly. Eleanor walked along rocky beaches each morning, the wind cool against her face, seagulls calling in steady, distant chorus. Each day, the ache in her chest loosened slightly, replaced by something smaller and steadier, acceptance perhaps, or the beginnings of forgiveness, though she wasn't certain for whom. She spent long hours reading, visiting small bookshops, and sitting in cafes where no one knew her name or story. When people asked if she was traveling alone, she nodded without shame or explanation. There was freedom in solitude that she'd never known before, a liberty to redefine herself without the weight of others' expectations. One afternoon, Eleanor sat by the harbor in a small Maine fishing village and completed a check addressed to the South Carolina Elder Support Fund, a local program Mr. Pierce had told her about. She wrote the amount slowly, the numbers rounding into certainty with each stroke of her pen. It wasn't charity. It was transformation, a way of turning something painful into something that might protect someone else from similar harm. When she mailed the envelope, she included a brief note to help others find their voice before it's too late. When Eleanor returned to Charleston, the city felt different, somehow softer around its edges, the air gentler against her skin. The apartment greeted her with its familiar creaks and the faint scent of lemon polish that lingered from the cleaning service. Sarah had left a small note in the mailbox, the handwriting careful and measured. "Thank you for letting truth matter more than blood. Take care of yourself." Eleanor folded it precisely and tucked it into the drawer where she kept important papers. That evening, she stepped onto her balcony as twilight descended. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky awash in watercolor hues of rose and gold. She switched on the porch light, the same bulb that had guided her family home for decades, and stood there for a long moment, watching its glow spread across the darkening street. "This light isn't for waiting anymore," Eleanor whispered to the empty air. "It's for peace." Eleanor woke to the sound of rain tapping against her bedroom window, a gentle percussion that almost but not quite masked the deeper silence of her apartment. 1 month had passed since the confrontation with Michael. The legal proceedings had moved into a new phase, becoming something clinical, and detached a process that reduced betrayal to paper and paragraphs. The morning light filtered through Charleston's perpetual humidity, casting gray shadows across her bedspread. Eleanor had developed new rituals to fill the spaces that family once occupied. Morning coffee on the balcony, volunteer work at the library 3 afternoons a week, evening walks along the harbor with deliberate measured steps. activities chosen for their ability to structure time rather than merely pass it. She reached for her phone out of habit, scanning for messages. Nothing from Michael, which was both a relief and a hollow ache. Sarah wrote regularly from Atlanta, where she'd relocated with her sister while finalizing the divorce. Rita called daily, her concerns wrapped in cheerful anecdotes designed to distract. The phone buzzed unexpectedly in Eleanor's hand, an unfamiliar number with a local area code. She answered cautiously her hello, more question than greeting. The voice on the other end was male apologetic, yet firm. "Mrs. Campbell, this is Detective Marcus Holden with Charleston PD. I'm calling about your son, Michael Campbell." Eleanor's heart contracted. "Has something happened to him?" "Nothing like that, ma'am. We're investigating financial improprieties at his law firm. Documents have surfaced, suggesting broader patterns of behavior similar to what you reported. I'd like to meet with you if you're willing." 20 minutes later, Eleanor stood before her closet, selecting clothing with unusual care armor for the battle ahead. She chose a navy dress with structured shoulders, pearl earrings that had belonged to her mother, sensible shoes that would keep her firmly grounded. The person in the mirror looked older than she remembered the lines around her mouth, deeper, more pronounced. Detective Holden was waiting at the station, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and the patient expression of someone who'd heard every possible human story. He led Eleanor to a small room furnished with a table, 4 chairs, and nothing else. The walls were painted in institutional beige that reminded her of hospital waiting rooms. He placed a folder on the table between them. "Mrs. Campbell, what began as an investigation into your son's actions regarding your property has expanded. We've discovered irregularities in his handling of client trust accounts at the law firm. Several elderly clients with significant assets." Eleanor's fingers curled against the smooth wood of the table. "You're saying there are others, at least 3 cases with similar patterns. Falsified signatures on power of attorney documents, unauthorized transfers from accounts he managed professionally. We believe your cousin Peter Warren was involved in selecting potential targets." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a persistent artificial sound that seemed to underscore the unreality of the moment. Eleanor tried to reconcile this information with the son she thought she knew, the boy who'd insisted on returning extra change when a cashier made a mistake, the law student who'd spoken passionately about justice. What happens now? The question emerged more steadily than she felt. "The district attorney is considering charges of elder financial abuse and fraud, multiple counts." Detective Holden's expression softened slightly. "Mrs. Campbell, I understand this is difficult, but your testimony would strengthen the case considerably." The weight of this request settled across Eleanor's shoulders. To stand in court and speak against her own child, the final severance of a bond already frayed beyond recognition. Yet silence would make her complicit in the harm done to others who, unlike her, might not have had a Sarah to sound the alarm. "I'll do whatever is necessary," she said finally. "These other people, are they recovering what was taken?" "We're working on asset recovery, but financial damage isn't the only concern. This kind of betrayal." Detective Holden left the sentence unfinished, understanding that Eleanor needed no explanation. She nodded, memories flashing of those first days after discovering Michael's plan, the disorientation, the second-guessing of every interaction, the fundamental rewriting of their shared history. As she left the police station, rain began again, heavier now. Eleanor declined Detective Holden's offer to call a taxi, preferring to walk despite the weather. Each step through the downpour felt cleansing, as though the rain might wash away the fresh layer of grief this new information had deposited. Her phone rang twice during the walk home. Rita first, then Mr. Pierce. Eleanor let both calls go to voicemail, needing solitude to process what she'd learned. By the time she reached her building, her clothes were soaked through, clinging to her skin like a second heavier self. The doorman's concerned expression followed her across the lobby. "Mrs. Campbell, you're drenched. Shall I send up some towels?" "That won't be necessary, Thomas, but thank you." The elevator doors closed on his worried face. Inside her apartment, Eleanor peeled off wet layers and stood under a shower hot enough to steam the bathroom mirrors. The heat penetrated muscles tightened by tension, but couldn't reach the cold knot lodged beneath her ribs, the place where maternal pride had once lived. She dressed in dry clothes and made tea, carrying the cup to her home office. The room felt different since she'd reclaimed it. The lock replaced the files, reorganized new passwords protecting her accounts. Security measures against a threat she never could have anticipated. Eleanor opened her laptop and composed an email to Mr. Pierce, outlining what Detective Holden had shared. The attorney's response came within minutes, a phone call rather than written words. Mr. Pierce's voice carried measured concern. "This changes the scope significantly. The DA will almost certainly pursue felony charges now. You should prepare yourself for a more public proceeding than we initially anticipated." "What about these other victims? Will I meet them?" "Potentially, though victim conferences are typically separate. I can arrange a meeting if you feel it would be helpful." Eleanor considered this. Yes, I think it would. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon at Mr. Pierce's office. Eleanor arrived early, watching raindrops trace patterns down the office window while she waited. The door opened to admit 3 people, a woman perhaps a decade older than Eleanor leaning on a cane, a couple in their 70s, the husband guiding his wife with a protective hand at her elbow. Mr. Pierce made introductions: Vivian Mercer, a retired school principal; Harold and Margaret Cohen, former owners of a local bakery. All had entrusted legal matters to Michael's firm. All had discovered too late that their trust had been misplaced. Vivian spoke first, her voice carrying the crisp diction of someone who had maintained order in school hallways for 40 years. "I never married, never had children. When my sister died, I had no close family left. Your son was recommended as someone who specialized in estate planning for people in my situation." Her fingers tightened around the head of her cane. "He was so attentive, so concerned about my welfare. When he suggested consolidating my accounts for easier management, it seemed sensible. I only discovered the withdrawals because my property taxes bounced something that had never happened in 50 years of home ownership." Harold Cohen nodded in grim understanding. "For us, it was the nursing home calling about unpaid bills for Margaret's mother. Money that should have been in a dedicated trust. When I questioned it, Michael assured me it was an administrative error. 2 days later, Peter Warren called to say they'd discovered accounting irregularities and were conducting an internal audit." Margaret touched her husband's arm, her eyes clouding. "We'd known the Campbell family for years. Your husband used to stop by our bakery every Saturday for sourdough. That connection was partly why we chose Michael when we needed legal help." Eleanor felt a stab of guilt, as though her family name had been the lure that drew these people into her son's deception. "I'm so sorry," she began, but Vivian cut her off with a sharp gesture. "You have nothing to apologize for, Eleanor. You're as much a victim as any of us. More so in many ways. We lost money and trust. You lost a son." The simple truth of this statement hung in the air between them. Eleanor had indeed lost a son, not to death, but to something perhaps more absolute. The Michael she'd raised and loved existed now only in memory, replaced by a stranger who wore his face. "What are you hoping will happen with the legal case?" Eleanor asked after a moment. Harold exchanged glances with his wife. "Justice matters, of course, but mostly we want to prevent this from happening to others. Our generation was raised to trust professionals, doctors, lawyers, clergy. That trust is a weapon in the wrong hands. And we want to understand why," Margaret added softly. "Not excuses, but reasons. How someone chooses to become this version of themselves." The question resonated with Eleanor. She too wanted to understand the path that had led Michael from the child who'd stood up for weaker classmates to the man who preyed on vulnerability. What pressure or flaw or moment of moral compromise had been the turning point? As the meeting concluded, the 4 exchanged contact information. There was something fortifying about this new connection, a community founded on shared harm, but focused on recovery and prevention. Eleanor felt slightly steadier as she left the office, as though the burden had been redistributed among more capable shoulders. That evening, she received a text from an unfamiliar number. "Mom, it's me. Please talk to me. They're saying things that aren't true. I need to explain." Eleanor stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the screen. Michael must be using a friend's phone. His own number had been blocked on her advice from Mr. Pierce. The simple word "mom" struck her like a physical blow, a claim to a relationship he'd willingly shattered. She placed the phone face down without responding and went to stand on her balcony. Twilight had transformed the harbor into a palette d'étal of indigos and silvers. The familiar view suddenly seemed too confining, the furniture too imbued with memories. On impulse, Eleanor picked up the phone again and called Rita. "I need a change," she said without preamble. "Would you help me rearrange the apartment this weekend?" The project began Saturday morning. Rita arrived with coffee donuts and a determination that manifested as immediately pushing furniture aside to create a blank canvas. Together, they transformed the living space, moving the sofa to face the harbor, rather than the fireplace, replacing heavy drapes with lighter curtains, repositioning art on the walls. By late afternoon, the apartment felt different, still familiar in its bones, but refreshed, its energy redirected. Eleanor surveyed the results with satisfaction. It's not just that he was here going through my things, it's that afterward everything felt contaminated by his presence. This helps. It's a good first step, Rita agreed, settling onto the repositioned sofa with a glass of iced tea. But have you thought about making a bigger change? You've been in this building for 15 years. Maybe it's time for something completely new. The suggestion startled Eleanor. Leave the condo? The idea seemed simultaneously terrifying and liberating. I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of upheaval. Just something to consider. Sometimes starting fresh is easier than renovating what's broken. Rita's tone was casual, but her eyes watched Eleanor carefully. The seed was planted, though. Over the next few days, Eleanor found herself looking at her surroundings with a more critical eye, noting the ways in which the space still carried echoes of its former life. The family gatherings, holiday decorations, the comfortable routines built around people now absent. This contemplation was interrupted by a call from Detective Holden. "Mrs. Campbell, I wanted to inform you that we've made an arrest this morning. Your son Michael turned himself in accompanied by his attorney." The news shouldn't have been surprising. It was the logical next step in the process that had been unfolding for weeks. Still, the reality of Michael in custody, formally charged, processed through the system like any other criminal, struck Eleanor with unexpected force. "What happens next?" Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. "Arraignment tomorrow morning. The judge will set bail, assuming it's granted. Based on similar cases and the fact that he surrendered voluntarily, he'll likely be released pending trial." After the call ended, Eleanor sat motionless, absorbing the information. Tomorrow, her son would stand before a judge, enter a plea, be assigned a case number in the vast machinery of justice. The proceedings would become public record, reported in local media, discussed by neighbors and former colleagues. Her phone rang again an hour later, Sarah this time, her voice tight with restrained emotion. "I just heard about the arrest from a friend at the courthouse. Are you all right?" "I'm managing," Eleanor replied, the understatement almost comical in its inadequacy. "How about you?" "This can't be easy. I filed the final divorce papers this morning, actually." "Strange timing." Sarah paused. "Eleanor, there's something else you should know. Michael's been trying to contact Jason and Emily, sending messages through friends claiming he's being persecuted and needs their support." Jason and Emily, Michael and Sarah's children currently away at college. Eleanor's grandchildren, who had been mercifully distant from the unfolding disaster. "Have they responded?" Emily blocked the messages. Jason's more conflicted. He idolized his father. Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "I'm trying to be fair, not poison their relationship, but they need to understand the reality of what's happening." The complexity of the damage expanded with each conversation. Not just financial harm to elderly clients, not just the betrayal of Eleanor's trust, but ripples extending outward, a marriage destroyed, children forced to confront a father's disgrace, a family name tarnished in a community that valued reputation. Eleanor thought of her grandchildren, how they must be struggling to reconcile the father they'd known with the man described in criminal complaints. Would it help if I spoke with them? Not to influence their decisions, just to offer support. I think it might, especially for Jason. He's always valued your perspective. Sarah sounded relieved at the suggestion. He's coming home this weekend, perhaps Sunday lunch. The prospect of seeing Jason stirred both anticipation and anxiety. Eleanor hadn't spoken directly with either grandchild since the initial discovery, uncertain what Sarah had told them, and wary of inserting herself into an already painful situation. Sunday arrived with Charleston's typical late spring splendor, azaleas blooming in riotous color, the air scented with jasmine, and warmed by generous sunshine. Eleanor prepared lunch with extra care, selecting Jason's favorite foods, and setting the table on the balcony to take advantage of the harbor view. When the doorbell rang, she smoothed her dress with suddenly nervous hands before answering. Jason stood in the hallway, taller than she remembered his face, bearing new lines of strain, around eyes that were so like his father's, it caused a momentary jolt. Their hug was brief, but genuine. As they settled at the table, Eleanor noticed how Jason's gaze tracked around the apartment, noting the changes. "You've rearranged things," he observed, spooning salad onto his plate. It seemed time for a refresh. Your grandmother's helping me consider even bigger changes. Like moving? Jason looked surprised. But you love this place. I did. I do. But places like people can change in our estimation. Eleanor kept her tone light, though the parallel was intentional. Jason absorbed this pushing food around his plate more than eating it. Mom says I should hear your side of what's happening with Dad. She says there's evidence. There is? Eleanor chose her words with care, balancing truth against the awareness that regardless of Michael's actions, he remained Jason's father. Video recordings, financial records, testimony from others who were affected. It's not a misunderstanding, Jason. I wish it were. But prison criminal charges. It seems extreme for what amounts to financial disagreements. His tone held a defensive edge. Is that how your father characterized it? Eleanor felt a flare of anger at Michael's apparent minimization. What happened wasn't a disagreement. It was a systematic effort to take control of assets that didn't belong to him, not just mine, but those belonging to vulnerable clients who trusted him professionally. Jason's expression clouded. He says everyone's overreacting, that he was trying to protect your interests because you're getting older, making some concerning decisions. The familiar narrative, the caring son, the declining parent, the necessary intervention, was so cleanly crafted that Eleanor almost admired its strategic brilliance. In another circumstance with another family, it might have been plausible enough to create reasonable doubt. Would you like to see the recordings? Eleanor asked quietly. I have them. You can judge for yourself whether I appear to need that kind of protection. Jason hesitated, fork suspended midway to his mouth. I'm not sure. Because you're afraid of what you'll see, or because you already suspect the truth and prefer the comfort of uncertainty? Eleanor leaned forward slightly. I understand, Jason. It's easier to believe in misunderstandings than betrayals, but living in denial doesn't serve anyone, least of all your father. His shoulders slumped slightly. I want to believe him. He's my dad. Yes, he is, and nothing changes that connection. But part of adulthood is seeing our parents as complete people, flawed, complex, capable of both tremendous love and terrible mistakes. Eleanor reached across the table to touch his hand. Whatever you decide to believe about this situation, know that my door is always open to you. That never changes. After lunch, Jason asked to see the video footage. Eleanor connected her phone to the television, then stepped onto the balcony to give him privacy while he watched. Through the glass doors, she could see his expression, change confusion giving way to dismay, then a flash of anger quickly suppressed. When he joined her outside, his eyes were red-rimmed. I didn't want to believe it. Even seeing it, He trailed off, shaking his head. How do you reconcile this with the person you thought you knew? The question struck at the heart of what Eleanor had been struggling with for weeks. I'm still working on that. Some days I think about every good memory, every moment of genuine connection, and wonder if they were all somehow fraudulent. Other days I believe those moments were real, and that people can compartmentalize, be loving in some contexts while making destructive choices in others. Jason leaned against the railing, looking out toward the harbor. He wants me to speak as a character witness at the trial. And will you? I don't know. Until today I thought I might. Now? He straightened, turning to face her directly. I'm sorry, Grandma, for what he did, for doubting you. You have nothing to apologize for. Loyalty is a virtue, Jason. So is critical thinking. You're navigating an impossible situation with more grace than many adults manage. Eleanor touched his cheek gently. Just remember, you don't have to choose between loving your father and acknowledging his actions. Those aren't mutually exclusive. After Jason left, Eleanor felt drained but oddly lighter, as though the conversation had cleared away another layer of the fog that had surrounded her since that first shocking discovery. She called Rita to share the interaction. He's a good kid, Rita said after listening. This has got to be tearing him apart. It is. But he's stronger than he realizes. They both are. Eleanor thought of Emily, who had apparently drawn her boundaries more decisively. I'm hoping to see Emily soon, too. Sarah says she's coming home in 2 weeks. And the arraignment, that's tomorrow, isn't it? 9 a.m. Mr. Pierce says I don't need to attend, but I feel I should. Not for Michael's sake, but for the other victims. To show solidarity. The courtroom the next morning was smaller than Eleanor had imagined, the proceedings less formal, yet somehow more solemn than television dramas suggested. She sat in the back row beside Vivian Mercer, whose spine remained ramrod straight despite the emotional weight of the occasion. Michael entered wearing a suit that looked slightly too large, as though he'd lost weight. He kept his eyes forward, not scanning the gallery where Eleanor sat. The charges were read multiple counts of financial elder abuse fraud, falsification of documents. When asked how he pled, Michael's voice was clear and unwavering. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Beside Eleanor, Vivian made a small sound of disgust. "Of course he pleads not guilty. They always do, even with mountains of evidence." Eleanor remained silent. She had expected this plea. Mr. Pierce had prepared her for it, but the public declaration of innocence still landed like a blow. The judge set bail at an amount that seemed simultaneously enormous and inadequate. Michael's attorney immediately stated that they were prepared to post it. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered on the steps. Eleanor and Vivian exited through a side door, avoiding the impromptu press conference that Michael's lawyer appeared to be conducting. They walked to a nearby cafe, ordered coffee, and sat watching pedestrians pass by, each absorbed in their own thoughts. "It's going to be a long process," Vivian said finally. "Months, probably. Are you prepared for that?" Eleanor considered the question. "I don't think anyone can truly prepare for something like this. You just endure it day by day and hope there's something worthwhile on the other side." "There is." Vivian's certainty was compelling. "I've lived 76 years, Eleanor. I've seen people survive unimaginable losses and find purpose again. The trick is to keep moving forward even when it feels impossible, especially then." That evening, Eleanor received another text from the unknown number. "Why were you in court today? Are you working with them against me after everything I've done for you?" The message vibrated with entitlement, devoid of the remorse or self-reflection that might have indicated a path toward reconciliation. Eleanor deleted it without responding, then blocked the number. If Michael wanted to communicate, he could do so through proper legal channels. She called Mr. Pierce to report the contact. "He seems to believe he's the wronged party," she noted, still unsettled by the message's tone. "That's not uncommon in these cases. The human capacity for self-justification is remarkable." Mr. Pierce sounded tired. "The discovery phase begins next week. It's likely to uncover additional evidence, possibly involving more victims. You should prepare yourself for that possibility." The warning proved prescient. Within days, Detective Holden requested another meeting. This time he brought a colleague, a forensic accountant, who spread documents across the table with methodical precision. "We've identified 2 more potential victims," Detective Holden explained. "Both elderly widows with substantial estates, both clients of your son's firm. The pattern is consistent: gaining trust, obtaining power of attorney, then gradual siphoning of assets through a complex network of transfers." The accountant pointed to highlighted sections of bank statements. The money typically moved through several accounts before ending up here: investment properties in North Carolina, all purchased within the last 3 years under an LLC registered to Peter Warren. Eleanor studied the documents, a chill spreading through her as the scope of the operation became clearer. This wasn't impulsive. It was calculated, sustained. Yes, and based on electronic records, it's been ongoing for approximately 5 years. Detective Holden's expression was grave. "Mrs. Campbell, I need to ask, had you noticed any changes in your son's lifestyle during that period? Unusual purchases, unexplained absences, new associates?" The question prompted Eleanor to mentally review the past 5 years. There had been changes: a new car membership and an exclusive club, renovations to his home, but nothing that couldn't be explained by career success. Michael had been a partner at his firm, presumably earning a substantial income. "He seemed to be doing well professionally," she said slowly. "I assumed his lifestyle reflected that. There were a few comments about investment opportunities, property deals that Peter was facilitating." The accountant nodded. "The money trails suggest most of the misappropriated funds went into these properties. They weren't living extravagantly. They were building a real estate portfolio, likely planning for long-term gain." "Which means asset recovery might actually be possible," Detective Holden added. "Unlike cases where funds are spent on gambling or luxury goods, these investments could potentially be liquidated to repay victims." The notion offered small comfort. Recovery of funds couldn't erase the betrayal or restore trust. But for people like Vivian and the Cohens, it might at least provide financial stability and a sense that justice had been served. As Eleanor left the station, a sudden realization struck her. Throughout the meeting, she had thought of Michael not as her son, but as a subject of investigation. The maternal instinct to protect, to make excuses, to seek mitigating circumstances had receded. In its place was a clear-eyed assessment of actions and consequences unmarred by the emotional fog that had initially clouded her judgment. This clarity followed her home, informing her decision to call a real estate agent. The conversation with Rita had taken root, growing from suggestion to intention. It was time for a fresh start, a space without layered memories or associations with betrayal. The agent arrived the following day, an energetic woman named Claire, who toured the apartment with professional enthusiasm, noting its harbor views and premium fixtures. "The market's strong right now, especially for waterfront properties. We should be able to list at a very attractive price. I'd like to move quickly," Eleanor explained. "I'm looking for something smaller, perhaps in a different neighborhood." Claire made notes on her tablet. "Any particular areas you're considering?" Eleanor hadn't thought that far ahead. Her mental map of Charleston was shaped by decades of family connections. The park where Michael had played as a child, the restaurants they'd frequented for celebrations, the church where they'd mourned Richard. Perhaps it was time to explore parts of the city that held no such associations. Somewhere north of the peninsula, maybe. Something walkable but quieter than downtown. "I have several possibilities that might suit you. Shall we look at them this week?" The prospect of viewing potential new homes created a spark of anticipation Eleanor hadn't expected to feel. Each property represented not just square footage and amenities, but possible futures, different versions of a life rebuilt from unexpected ruins. She called Rita to share the decision. "You were right. I need a completely fresh start." "I'm proud of you, Ellie. It takes courage to make big changes, especially after a lifetime in one place." Rita paused. "Have you thought about what you'll do with all the furniture, the things you and Richard collected over the years?" The question highlighted another layer of decisions ahead, sorting through decades of accumulated possessions, determining what to keep, sell, or give away. Some items carried memories too precious to relinquish, while others now seemed tainted by recent events. "I'll take what matters most. The rest?" Eleanor considered the dining table where family dinners had once been served, the guest room that had housed visiting relatives, the bookshelves filled with volumes that charted their changing interests over time. "The rest can go to people who will value them without the shadows I now see." That night, Eleanor began the process of psychological sorting, moving through rooms with a notepad listing items in 3 columns. Keep, donate, sell. The activity proved unexpectedly therapeutic, each decision a small reclamation of agency after months of reacting to circumstances beyond her control. In the study, she paused before a photograph of Michael's law school graduation, her son in cap and gown, flanked by his proud parents, the future stretching bright and unblemished before them. The memory of that day remained vivid, the spring sunshine, the sense of accomplishment, Richard's tearful pride in their only child's achievement. Eleanor removed the photo from its frame and placed it in a folder marked Family History for later. Not discarded, but set aside until she could view it with greater emotional distance. Some reconciliations could only happen with time. The following day brought another meeting with Mr. Pierce, this time focused on the upcoming trial preparations. The prosecutor wanted Eleanor to testify about the events leading to her discovery of Michael's plans, the warning from Sarah, the hidden camera, the confrontation that followed. "It will be difficult," Mr. Pierce warned. "Michael's attorney will attempt to characterize your actions as paranoid, possibly influenced by Sarah's supposed vendetta against her husband. They may suggest you misinterpreted innocent activities." "But there's video evidence," Eleanor protested. "His own words, his actions in my home." "Yes, and that evidence is compelling, but defense attorneys are skilled at creating alternative narratives, planting seeds of doubt." Mr. Pierce leaned forward slightly. "The most important thing is to remain calm and factual. Don't let emotion overtake your testimony, no matter how provocative the questioning becomes." The advice seemed impossible to follow. How could anyone remain detached while publicly recounting such intimate betrayal? Yet Eleanor recognized the necessity. For the other victims, for Sarah, for her grandchildren, she needed to present the truth with unassailable clarity. "I'll be ready," she promised, hoping the words would prove prophetic. As she left the office, Eleanor's phone chimed with a text from Sarah. "Emily's flight arrives Friday evening. She wants to have dinner with you Saturday, just the two of you. Is that all right?" The prospect of seeing her granddaughter, the more distant of the two since childhood, now apparently the more decisive in her response to her father's actions, filled Eleanor with both anticipation and trepidation. What would they say to each other after all that had happened? What comfort could she possibly offer? "Tell her I'd love that," Eleanor replied, already planning the meal, the conversation the careful balance between acknowledgement and forward momentum. The week proceeded with increasing momentum. Eleanor viewed 3 potential new homes, each offering different advantages: a garden apartment in a historic building, a modern condo with community amenities, a small cottage with a private courtyard. None felt exactly right, but the search itself provided focus and purpose. Claire listed the harbor condo at a price that made Eleanor blink. "The market's even stronger than I anticipated," the agent explained. "Plus your unit has premium finishes and that spectacular view. How quickly do you think it might sell? At this price point, we should expect serious interest within days, possibly multiple offers. Are you prepared for that timeline?" The question carried weight beyond real estate logistics. Was Eleanor truly ready to leave this space that had housed so much of her history? The answer came with surprising certainty. Yes, it's time. That evening, as she packed another box of books, Eleanor contemplated the strange trajectory that had brought her to this moment of transition. 6 months ago, her life had seemed settled into predictable patterns. Now each day brought new developments, decisions, recalibrations of what she believed possible. There was pain in this upheaval, certainly, but there was also unexpected growth connections strengthened or newly formed with Rita, with Sarah, with Vivian and the Cohens, with her grandchildren in evolving ways. Perhaps this was what Vivian had meant about finding purpose on the other side of loss. Eleanor taped the box closed and labeled it with neat black marker. Tomorrow would bring Emily's visit another step in the ongoing process of rebuilding. The work continued box by box, day by day, choice by choice. She moved to the balcony, watching lights flicker across the harbor waters. This view had witnessed her joy and her devastation. Soon it would belong to someone else, frame someone else's life transitions. The thought brought not sadness, but a strange peace. The recognition that while betrayal had shattered her former life, the fragments were slowly reforming into something new. Not whole, not yet, but becoming. The evening before Emily's arrival, Eleanor received a message from Claire, 3 offers on the condo all above, asking price 2 waiving inspections. The news should have elicited celebration, or at least satisfaction. Instead, Eleanor felt a flutter of panic. The theoretical decision to move had crystallized into imminent reality signatures and timelines, packing and farewells. The momentum she'd sought now threatened to overwhelm her. She poured a glass of wine and stepped onto the balcony, seeking the familiar solace of the harbor view. A container ship glided past its deck, stacked with colorful metal boxes, ferrying goods from distant ports. Eleanor wondered about the journeys those containers had taken, the storms they might have weathered before reaching this calm harbor. "Storms reshape shorelines," Richard had once told her during a beach vacation, pointing to eroded dunes. "They look destructive, and they are. But they also create new landscapes, new possibilities." Eleanor hadn't recognized her life's storm when it first gathered on the horizon, that seemingly innocuous phone call from Sarah, the request that had sounded so bizarre. Now, standing on the edge of yet another transformation, she wondered what new landscapes awaited. Her phone chimed with a text from Emily. "Just boarded. See you tomorrow, Grandma. Love you." 2 simple sentences that conveyed so much continuity amid disruption, the persistent bonds of family despite the fractures within it. Eleanor responded with equal simplicity. "Safe travels. Love you too." Morning brought unseasonable heat, Charleston's humidity wrapping around the city like a damp blanket. Eleanor prepared for Emily's visit with meticulous care, fresh flowers on the dining table, Emily's favorite lemon tart from the bakery on King Street, the spare bedroom arranged with clean linens and a small welcome basket. These familiar rituals of hospitality provided structure, but couldn't quiet the undercurrent of anxiety. Emily had always been the more reserved of her grandchildren, harder to read than her brother. While Jason wore his emotions openly, Emily processed hers privately, revealing conclusions only after careful consideration. Eleanor couldn't predict how the young woman would approach this unprecedented family crisis. Sarah dropped Emily off shortly after noon. The initial greeting carried a tension that neither addressed directly, a careful dance around the absence that defined their reunion. Emily's hug was brief but genuine, her smile tinged with caution. "The condo looks different," Emily observed, glancing around the rearranged living room. "I like what you've done with it." "Thank you, though it won't be mine much longer. I've accepted an offer." Emily's eyebrows rose. "That was fast. Jason mentioned you were thinking about moving, but I didn't realize it was already happening." "Neither did I, honestly. But once the decision was made, everything accelerated. Eleanor gestured toward the kitchen. "Are you hungry? I've prepared lunch." Over salad and iced tea, they navigated careful conversation. Emily's studies, summer plans, mutual acquaintances. The essential topic remained untouched, a palpable absence around which they constructed elaborate verbal pathways. Finally, as Eleanor served the lemon tart, Emily placed her fork deliberately on the edge of her plate. "Mom says you're testifying at Dad's trial." The directness was so unexpected that Eleanor paused mid-motion, the dessert server suspended over the table. "Yes. The prosecutor believes my testimony will help establish a pattern. Jason told me he watched the videos of Dad in your apartment." Emily's voice held a carefully neutral tone. "He said they were conclusive. They leave little room for interpretation." Eleanor agreed, resuming her task of serving dessert with hands that suddenly felt unsteady. "I haven't watched them. I'm not sure I want to." Emily traced a pattern on the tablecloth with one fingertip. "It's easier in some ways not seeing it firsthand. I can maintain a little distance." The admission carried no request for the footage, no desire to verify Jason's assessment. Emily had made her decision based on accumulated evidence and trust in those who had witnessed directly. Eleanor recognized something familiar in this approach, a pragmatic acceptance that mirrored her own response once the initial shock had passed. "Sometimes distance provides clarity," she offered, "especially from people who've hurt us. That's the strange part. I'm angry, but I don't feel hurt exactly." Emily looked up, meeting Eleanor's gaze directly. "It's more like discovering a fundamental error in how I understood the world, like finding out gravity works differently than you always believed." The analogy resonated. Eleanor had experienced that same vertiginous sensation, the sudden realization that relationships she'd thought solid were built on shifting sand. "The ground doesn't feel quite steady anymore," she agreed. "Exactly. And I keep wondering what I missed. Were there signs? Things I should have questioned?" Emily's composure wavered slightly. "Mom says there's no point in that kind of thinking, that Dad was deliberately deceptive. But I can't help wondering." Eleanor reached across the table to cover her granddaughter's hand with her own. "I've asked myself the same questions. We all have. Your father presented one version of himself to the world, to his family, clients, colleagues. If we didn't see behind that facade, it's because he worked very hard to maintain it. But why? That's what I can't understand. He had everything a successful career family who loved him, respect in the community. Why risk all that?" Frustration edged Emily's voice. "Jason thinks it was about the money, pure greed. Mom suggests there might have been gambling debts or other financial pressures we didn't know about. What do you think?" The question had haunted Eleanor through sleepless nights and quiet mornings. What transforms a person who understands right from wrong, who has been raised with values and opportunities, into someone capable of such calculated betrayal? "I believe it began with smaller compromises, ethical shortcuts that seemed justified in the moment. Each successful deception made the next one easier until the behavior became normalized." Eleanor chose her words carefully. "Your father convinced himself he was entitled to more than he had, that his needs outweighed the harm he caused. That kind of self-deception is powerful." Emily absorbed this in silence, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think he'll ever truly acknowledge what he did? Not just legally, but really understand the impact?" "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "True accountability requires honest self-reflection. That's something only he can choose." After lunch, they walked along the harbor promenade, the familiar route now carrying the weight of potential lasts, perhaps the final time Eleanor would follow this path as a resident rather than a visitor. Emily linked her arm through her grandmother's, a gesture of solidarity that spoke more eloquently than words. "I've been offered an internship in Seattle for the fall semester," Emily said as they paused to watch a sailboat tack across the harbor. "I was hesitant to accept because of everything happening here, but Mom thinks I should go." "What do you think?" Eleanor asked. "Part of me feels like I should stay close, be supportive during the trial, but another part wants distance from all of this." She gestured vaguely toward the city behind them. "Charleston feels heavy right now, loaded with history I'm not ready to process." "Then go to Seattle," Eleanor said with sudden certainty. "Build something new there, something that's entirely yours. The situation here will unfold whether you're present or not." "What about you? Where will you go after selling the condo?" Eleanor had been considering this question with increasing urgency. The offers on her property included flexible closing dates, but a decision would soon be necessary. I'm looking at a cottage in Mount Pleasant. It's smaller, but it has a garden and a sunroom, a fresh start. I'd like to see it before I leave, Emily said. Help you imagine how to arrange things, maybe. The simple offer brought a lump to Eleanor's throat, this glimpse of normal family interaction of continuity despite the fractures. I'd like that very much. When they returned to the condo, Emily noticed the boxes stacked in the study. You've already started packing. Can I help? Together, they tackled the bookshelves, wrapping volumes in newspaper and sorting them into categories. The activity provided natural opportunities for memory-sharing books. Richard had loved stories Eleanor had read to Michael as a child, literary discoveries that had marked different life chapters. Emily paused, holding a leather-bound collection of poetry. This was Dad's graduation gift from you and Grandpa, wasn't it? I remember him showing it to me when I was little. Yes, he loved Frost back then. Eleanor felt a pang of remembrance. Michael at 18, earnest and idealistic, reciting The Road Not Taken from memory. Should we set it aside for him? Emily asked tentatively. The question hung between them, practical, yet layered with implications about future relationships, about the possibility of salvaging connections despite irreparable damage. Let's put it in a separate box, Eleanor decided. For later, when the time is right. That evening, they ordered takeout and ate on the balcony, watching the sunset paint the harbor in spectacular oranges and purples. The conversation flowed more easily now, the initial awkwardness dissolved by shared activity and the tacit acknowledgement of their new reality. Mom's thinking about moving too, Emily revealed. Back to Virginia near her sister. She says Atlanta was always more Dad's choice than hers. Another ripple effect of Michael's actions, Sarah reclaiming her own preferences after years of accommodation. Eleanor wondered how many other choices had been subtly influenced by her son's priorities, his vision of their collective lives. Your mother is stronger than she sometimes appears, Eleanor observed. This hasn't been easy for her, but she's handling it with remarkable grace. She cries sometimes when she thinks we can't hear. Not for Dad, I don't think, but for what we all lost. Emily's expression turned pensive. That's what makes me angriest, actually. Not the money or the legal issues, but that he broke something that can't be fixed. Our family will never be the same. The simple truth of this statement hung in the warm evening air. The Campbell family had been irreversibly altered, its configuration and connections transformed by choices that couldn't be unmade. Different doesn't necessarily mean lesser, Eleanor said after a moment. What we're building now, this new understanding between us, the honesty we share that has value too. Emily stayed 3 days, helping with packing and accompanying Eleanor to view the Mount Pleasant cottage a second time. The property revealed new charms upon closer inspection: a mature gardenia bush by the front door, built-in bookshelves in the living room, a kitchen with ample natural light. I can see you here, Emily declared, standing in the center of the sunroom. It suits you somehow. Eleanor felt it too, a sense of rightness, of possibility. She signed the purchase agreement that afternoon, setting in motion yet another phase of transition. The day of Emily's departure brought unexpected news. Detective Holden called to report that Peter Warren had been located in Asheville and taken into custody. He had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for consideration in sentencing. This significantly strengthens the case, Detective Holden explained. Warren has provided detailed information about the scheme, including documentation we hadn't previously discovered. Will his cooperation affect the charges against my son? Eleanor asked, uncertain whether she hoped for leniency or the full weight of consequences. That will ultimately be the prosecutor's decision. But Warren's testimony establishes your son as the primary architect of the fraud. According to Warren, Michael identified potential victims and created the legal framework that enabled the misappropriation. The confirmation of Michael's central role, not influenced or pressured but initiating, landed heavily. Any lingering hope that her son had somehow been led astray dissolved in the face of this new evidence. After the call ended, Eleanor shared the development with Emily, who absorbed the news with characteristic thoughtfulness. So Dad was the mastermind, not just a participant. It appears so. Eleanor couldn't soften this reality, couldn't offer the comfort of mitigating circumstances. I've been thinking about something you said earlier about how it probably started with small compromises that escalated over time. Emily's voice was measured. I wonder when that first step happened. What was the moment when he decided that rules didn't apply to him? The question had no answer, only speculation. Whatever internal justifications Michael had constructed remained opaque to those who had trusted him most. Eleanor drove Emily to the airport that afternoon, their goodbye carrying the weight of uncertain futures. "Call me when you land in Seattle," Eleanor reminded her. "And remember, whatever happens with the trial with your father, my door is always open to you." "I know." Emily hugged her fiercely. "We'll get through this, Grandma. All of us in our different ways." The simple declaration of collective resilience sustained Eleanor through the solitary evening that followed. As transitions accelerated the condo sale proceeding toward closing the cottage purchase, advancing through necessary inspections, she found herself increasingly drawn to the community that had formed around shared harm. Vivian Mercer invited Eleanor to join a support group for victims of elder fraud, a weekly gathering that combined practical advice with emotional processing. Harold and Margaret Cohen included her in their Sunday dinner ritual, their table expanding to embrace another person, navigating similar terrain. These connections provided context and perspective. Some group members had lost everything: homes, retirement savings, the financial security of decades. Others had suffered more personal betrayals: a nephew who drained accounts while serving as caregiver, a trusted handyman who convinced an isolated widow to sign over property rights. Against these stories, Eleanor's experience seemed almost privileged. She had discovered this scheme before implementation, had resources for legal representation, enjoyed family support that many elders lacked. This recognition fostered a growing sense of responsibility, not just to participate in her son's prosecution, but to help create systems that might prevent similar exploitation. She began volunteering at the county's Elder Services office, reviewing materials about financial safety and contributing insights from her experience. The work provided structure during the liminal period between homes, between versions of her life. 3 weeks before the scheduled trial date, Mr. Pierce requested an urgent meeting. Eleanor arrived at his office to find him unusually animated papers spread across his typically immaculate desk. "The prosecution has received a plea offer from Michael's attorney," he announced without preamble. "He's willing to plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a sentence recommendation." Eleanor absorbed this unexpected development. What would that mean exactly? Instead of facing multiple felony counts with potential prison time of 15 to 20 years, he would plead to 3 lesser charges. The sentencing recommendation would include 2 years in a minimum security facility, followed by 5 years of supervised release and full restitution to all victims. And the prosecutor is considering this offer. Yes, it would spare the victims the stress of testifying, guarantee restitution, and still establish consequences for the behavior. Mr. Pierce leaned forward slightly. "Eleanor, they're asking for your input. As the initial complainant and a key witness, your perspective carries significant weight." The responsibility settled across her shoulders like a physical weight. Her decision could influence not only Michael's fate, but the experience of everyone affected by his actions. "What are the other victims saying?" she asked. "Divided. The Cohens prefer to avoid trial if restitution is guaranteed. Vivian, once her day in court, feels strongly about public accountability. The 2 newer victims are still considering their positions." Eleanor stood and moved to the window, needing physical space to process the implications. Outside, Charleston continued its ordinary rhythms: tourists following guides with raised umbrellas, office workers hurrying to lunch appointments, delivery trucks navigating narrow streets. If he pleads guilty, does that include a full admission, an acknowledgement of what he did to each victim? The question felt crucial, not just the legal consequences, but the recognition of harm caused. The plea would require a factual basis statement acknowledging the elements of each crime. It wouldn't necessarily include the kind of full reckoning you might be hoping for. Mr. Pierce's tone was gentle but realistic. Eleanor considered what justice meant in this context. Was it measured in years of incarceration, in financial restoration, or in something less tangible: accountability prevented future harm, restored dignity for those who had been exploited? "I need to think about this," she said finally. "Can I give you my answer tomorrow?" That evening she called Rita, then Sarah, seeking perspectives from the people who understood the complex layers of her relationship with Michael. Both conversations circled around the same essential questions. What outcome would bring the most healing? What would enable everyone involved to move forward? "Part of me wants him to face the maximum consequences," Eleanor admitted to Rita, "to ensure he can never do this to anyone else." "And the other part," her sister prompted gently. wonders if a longer sentence actually accomplishes anything beyond punishment. If he truly acknowledges what he did, makes restitution perhaps a shorter term with supervision afterward serves the same purpose. Rita's response was measured. The system isn't designed for rehabilitation, Ellie, but it's also not your responsibility to fix Michael or determine his fate. Your obligation is to yourself and to the others who were harmed. Sarah offered a different perspective during their call. I understand wanting to avoid a trial. It would be difficult for everyone, especially Jason and Emily. But I also worry about what message a lighter sentence sends to them about accountability. By morning, Eleanor had reached a decision, one that acknowledged the complexity of the situation while prioritizing practical outcomes. She called Mr. Pierce before breakfast. "I'll support the plea agreement on 2 conditions," she stated without preamble. First, restitution must be guaranteed and verified before sentencing. Second, Michael must agree to meet individually with each victim who wishes to speak with him directly about the impact of his actions. Mr. Pierce's brief silence suggested surprise at this unusual request. "The second condition isn't standard in plea agreements." "Then make it non-standard. This isn't only about legal consequences or financial restoration. It's about human impact. If he can't face the people he harmed, hear directly from them, then he should take his chances at trial." The proposal required negotiation between prosecutors and defense counsel, but ultimately both sides agreed. Michael would plead guilty to the reduced charges, guarantee restitution through liquidation of the North Carolina properties, and participate in impact conversations with any victim who requested one. Eleanor deliberated for days about whether to request such a meeting herself. What could possibly be gained from a direct conversation with the son who had betrayed her trust so profoundly? What words could address the magnitude of that breach? Yet something remained unresolved, questions that legal proceedings couldn't answer. 2 days before the scheduled plea hearing, she informed Mr. Pierce of her decision. "I want to meet with Michael, not at the courthouse or in any official capacity, somewhere neutral with you present as a witness." The meeting was arranged at Mr. Pierce's office on a Sunday afternoon. Eleanor arrived early, her stomach knotted with apprehension. She had prepared mentally for this encounter, yet still felt unprepared for the reality of facing Michael directly outside the structured environment of courtroom proceedings. When he entered, accompanied by his attorney, Eleanor was struck by the physical changes 3 months had wrought. Michael looked thinner, his complexion sallow dark circles shadowing his eyes. His posture carried a new stiffness, as though he were bracing against an expected blow. For a moment, no one spoke. The attorneys exchanged glances, uncertain how to facilitate this unconventional interaction. Eleanor finally broke the silence, her voice steadier than she had anticipated. "I have questions that won't be addressed in court. I'd like honest answers if you're capable of giving them." Michael nodded almost imperceptibly, his gaze fixed somewhere near her shoulder rather than meeting her eyes directly. "When did it start the first time you crossed a line you knew you shouldn't cross?" Eleanor needed to understand the genesis, the moment of first compromise. Michael shifted in his chair, discomfort evident in every line of his body. 6 years ago, a client with dementia signed documents he didn't fully understand. I could have invalidated them, ensured proper evaluation. Instead, I processed them as though everything were normal. "And that made the next step easier," Eleanor observed, not a question but a statement. "Yes." The admission emerged barely above a whisper. Each time the justification expanded. Clients who wouldn't miss the money. Arrangements they'd never notice. Eventually it seemed almost entitled. Entitled. The word hung between them, laden with implications. You felt entitled to take what others had worked for, saved for, because I convinced myself I deserved more than I had. That my knowledge of legal systems gave me the right to use them for personal gain. Michael finally raised his eyes to meet hers. "I'm not offering excuses. There aren't any." "And me, your own mother, was I just another vulnerable target?" The question that had haunted her most required articulation, however painful. Michael flinched visibly. "No, you were a last resort. The real estate investments were failing. Peter was pressing for capital. I told myself it was temporary, that you'd never know, that eventually I'd restore everything." "Self-delusion seems to be your particular talent." Eleanor observed the words sharp-edged, but delivered without heat. "Yes." Michael's agreement held no defensive edge. "I constructed elaborate justifications that collapsed the moment they faced reality." Eleanor studied her son, this stranger wearing familiar features, this person whose internal landscape had become unrecognizable to her. Do you understand what you've destroyed? Not just financially, but in terms of trust, family bonds, your children's sense of security. I'm beginning to. His voice caught slightly. Every day brings new awareness of another connection, severed, another relationship damaged beyond repair. Some things once broken can't be restored to their original form, Eleanor said quietly. They must become something entirely different if they're to exist at all. Michael nodded, something like genuine grief flickering across his features. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. Forgiveness isn't about deserving, Eleanor countered. It's about the person giving it their own healing process. Whether I eventually find that capacity remains to be seen. The meeting continued for nearly an hour, covering ground that court proceedings would never touch: the personal betrayals layered within the legal offenses, the ripple effects through family connections, the fundamental questioning of shared history that Michael's actions had triggered. When it concluded, Eleanor felt neither the catharsis of confrontation nor the weight of further injury. Instead, she experienced a curious emptiness, as though a long-carried burden had been set down, but nothing yet had taken its place. The plea hearing itself was anticlimactic after that intensely personal exchange. Michael stood before the judge, admitted his guilt in careful legal terms, accepted the negotiated consequences. The courtroom gallery held all the key figures from the months-long ordeal: Vivian and the Cohens, Detective Holden, Sarah, and Jason Rita steady at Eleanor's side. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered on the steps, seeking statements from prosecutors and victims alike. Eleanor declined to comment, allowing Mr. Pierce to deliver a brief statement, emphasizing the importance of financial protections for vulnerable adults. The system worked this time, but only because several alert individuals recognized warning signs and took action, he told the assembled microphones. We need stronger safeguards, better oversight, and increased awareness of these increasingly sophisticated schemes. The Cohens invited everyone to their home afterward, not a celebration exactly, but an acknowledgement of a chapter concluding. Around their dining table, conversation gradually shifted from the case itself to future plans, small victories, moments of unexpected grace discovered amid difficulty. Vivian spoke of using her settlement to establish a scholarship for students interested in elder law. The Cohens planned to fund financial literacy programs at senior centers. Sarah mentioned her upcoming move to Virginia, the teaching position she'd accepted at a community college there. Eleanor listened, struck by the resilience evident in each person's response to adversity. No one denied the harm done or minimized its impact, yet each had found ways to incorporate the experience into a continuing life narrative, rather than allowing it to become a permanent defining moment. 2 weeks later, Eleanor moved into the Mount Pleasant cottage. The transition from waterfront condo to garden-centered home marked more than a change of address. It represented a deliberate choice to reorient her life around new priorities, new possibilities. Rita helped arrange furniture, hanging curtains, and placing lamps to create pools of welcoming light throughout the space. It feels like you already, she declared, surveying their work. Peaceful, but not passive. Ready for whatever comes next. The whatever comes next began taking shape almost immediately. Eleanor's volunteer work expanded to include developing educational materials about financial exploitation, drawing on her first-hand experience to identify warning signs others might miss. She joined the board of the Elder Support Fund, the organization she'd donated to during her Maine trip. Their quarterly meetings focused on grant applications from groups working to prevent elder abuse through community outreach, legal assistance, and support services. These activities filled her calendar, but also served a deeper purpose, transforming a painful personal experience into something that might spare others similar harm. The work provided context and meaning, a framework for processing what had happened beyond the limiting narratives of victimhood or vengeance. 6 months after the plea hearing, Eleanor received a letter from the correctional facility where Michael was serving his sentence. She recognized his handwriting on the envelope, but set it aside unopened, not yet ready for whatever it might contain. The letter remained in her desk drawer, a conversation deferred until she felt equipped to engage with it. Meanwhile, life continued its forward motion. Sarah visited with updates on her new position photos of her apartment overlooking the Blue Ridge Mountains. Jason graduated and accepted a job in Chicago, eager for distance, but committed to regular calls and visits. Emily thrived in Seattle, eventually deciding to extend her internship into a permanent position. The family geography had expanded connections maintained across distances that were both physical and emotional. Holiday gatherings required careful coordination, new traditions emerging to replace those that no longer served. They found ways to acknowledge absences without allowing them to dominate shared experiences. 1 year to the day after Sarah's warning phone call, Eleanor hosted a small dinner party Rita Vivian the Cohens, 2 neighbors from the Mount Pleasant community. The evening unfolded with easy conversation, laughter, the comfortable rhythms of people who had chosen connection despite having met through difficult circumstances. As they lingered over dessert, Harold raised his glass in an impromptu toast. To unexpected communities formed in unlikely moments. And to rebuilding, Eleanor added, thinking of all they had each reconstructed from materials never intended for such use. Later, after the guests had departed, Eleanor stood in her garden beneath a sky scattered with stars. The night air carried the scent of jasmine and distant saltwater reminders of the coastal landscape that remained constant despite the changed view from her windows. She thought of the letter still waiting in her desk drawer, of the questions that remained unanswered, of the ongoing nature of healing and reconciliation. Perhaps tomorrow she would open it, or the next day, or next month. The timing would reveal itself when readiness aligned with necessity. For now, Eleanor inhaled the fragrant air and felt the solid ground beneath her feet, the earth that had continued to support her through seismic shifts, the foundation upon which she was building this next chapter. Not despite what had happened, but through it, and beyond it. The porch light illuminated her path back to the cottage door. No longer a beacon guiding others home, but a steady glow marking her own place in the world, reclaimed, reimagined, renewed.